The sudden blast of a shotgun tore through the silence of Cottonwood Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1882. As Royce Miller watched helplessly from the barren hilltop as outlaws rode away from his burning homestead. His weather-beaten hands trembled as he clutched his two small sons to his chest, their tiny bodies shaking with fear and hunger. "It's gone," he whispered, his voice cracking as the last of the roof collapsed in a shower of embers. "Everything's gone." 6-year-old Samuel clung to his father's leg while 4-year-old Thomas buried his face against Royce's worn denim shirt. The boys had already lost their mother to fever 2 winters past, and now the drought had claimed their crops, the raiders their livestock, and flames their home. "Pa, I'm hungry," Samuel whimpered, looking up with hollow eyes that had seen no proper meal in nearly 3 weeks. Royce knelt before his sons, his own stomach twisted with hunger and despair. At 34, he'd weathered drought, Indian raids, and the loss of his beloved wife, but nothing had prepared him for this feeling of utter helplessness. The few provisions they'd managed to salvage wouldn't last another day. "We'll find something," he promised, though the words felt hollow on his parched lips. "We've got to make it to Silverton. Your Uncle Jacob might take us in." But Silverton was nearly 80 miles away, and their horse had been stolen along with everything else of value. They had only their feet to carry them, and what little they could manage on their backs. As dusk settled over the scorched remains of their homestead, Royce gathered what he could: a dented tin cup, his hunting knife, a threadbare blanket, and the few cups of cornmeal that remained. He tucked his wife's tarnished silver locket into his breast pocket, the last reminder of happier days. "We'll start walking at first light," he told the boys as they huddled together beneath the stars. God will provide, but God, it seemed, had other plans for the Miller family. They'd been walking for 4 days, following the old trading route toward Silverton when Thomas's fever started. The boy's small face grew flushed and hot, his steps faltering until Royce was forced to carry him. Their water ran out on the 5th day and the last of the cornmeal on the 6th. Royce tried hunting, but the drought had driven most game far from the trail. Samuel hadn't complained, not once, though Royce could see the hunger etching itself deeper into his son's face with each passing day. The boy collected grasshoppers and shared them with his brother when they could find them, his small hands cupped carefully around the meager protein. On the 8th day, Thomas couldn't be roused at dawn. His skin burned beneath Royce's touch, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. "Samuel," Royce said, trying to keep his voice steady, "we need to find help. Real help." The boy nodded solemnly, his eyes too old for his young face. "Is Tommy gonna die like Ma?" The question struck Royce like a physical blow. "No," he answered firmly, gathering Thomas into his arms. "Not if I can help it." They altered their course, heading toward a thin line of smoke visible on the eastern horizon. It was a risk. Smoke could mean friendly settlers or hostile bandits, but Thomas needed medicine and food, and they were out of options. The small homestead appeared after several hours of desperate walking. It was modest but well kept, with a vegetable garden out front and chickens scratching in a nearby pen. A woman stood at a clothesline, hanging sheets that billowed in the dry breeze. She turned as they approached, one hand shading her eyes, the other reaching instinctively for something beside her, likely a weapon. "Please," Royce called out, his voice cracking with thirst. "My boy's sick. We've lost everything." The woman hesitated only briefly before approaching. She was younger than Royce had first thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with honey-brown hair pulled back from a sun-kissed face. Her simple calico dress couldn't hide the wariness in her stance. "What happened to you folks?" she asked, her eyes darting from Royce to the boys. "Raiders," Royce explained simply. "Burned us out. We've been walking for days." The woman's gaze settled on Thomas, limp in his father's arms, and her expression softened. "Bring him inside," she said, already turning toward the cabin. "I'm Josie Sullivan. Most folks call me Josie." The interior of Josie's cabin was cool and smelled of herbs and fresh bread. Royce nearly wept at the scent, his empty stomach clenching painfully. "Put him here," Josie directed, clearing a small cot by the hearth. Her movements were efficient but gentle as she pressed a hand to Thomas's forehead. "How long's he been like this?" "Fever started 4 days back," Royce answered, watching anxiously as she examined his son. "Got worse yesterday," Josie nodded, already reaching for a kettle. "Likely heat exhaustion on top of hunger. When did you all last eat proper?" Samuel, who had been standing silently by the door, spoke up. "Been 18 days since we had bread, madam." Josie's eyes widened, and she glanced at Royce with something like accusation. "Raiders took everything," he explained quietly. "I tried hunting, but—" He trailed off, the admission of failure too bitter on his tongue. Without a word, Josie turned to a small cupboard and withdrew a loaf of bread and a jar of preserves. "Feed your older boy first," she instructed, handing them to Royce. "Small portions. His stomach won't handle much." As Royce carefully broke off a small piece of bread for Samuel, Josie mixed a paste of herbs and honey. She coaxed it between Thomas's parched lips while humming a soft melody that reminded Royce painfully of his late wife. "You folks have a name?" Josie asked without looking up. "Miller." "I'm Royce. Boys are Samuel and Thomas," she nodded, continuing her work. "Well, Mr. Miller, your boys will stay here tonight. There's a creek out back for washing. I imagine you could use that." It wasn't a request. Royce recognized the steel beneath her gentle tone. This woman was used to being obeyed on her own property. "Yes, madam," he agreed, guiding Samuel outside after the boy had eaten a few bites. The cold creek water was a shock against his skin, but a blessed relief from the trail dust that had coated them for days. He scrubbed Samuel clean first, then himself, aware of the sorry state of their clothing. When they returned to the cabin, Josie had changed Thomas into a clean nightshirt that swallowed his small frame. "Belonged to my boy," she said simply when she caught Royce looking. "He outgrew it last year. Your husband around?" Royce asked carefully, noting the absence of a man's belongings in the cabin. Something flickered across Josie's face, pain quickly masked. "John's been gone 3 years now, caught by Comanche while hunting. My son Daniel and I manage." "I'm sorry," Royce offered, recognizing the familiar weight of widowhood they shared. "As am I for your losses," she replied. Then, practical again, "There's stew warming, eat slow." That night, after the boys were sleeping soundly, Royce stepped outside to find Josie sitting on her porch steps, staring at the stars. "I can't repay you," he admitted, the words difficult for a proud man. "Not right away." Josie's laugh was unexpected, a soft sound in the darkness. "I don't recall asking for payment, Mr. Miller." "Royce," he corrected. "And folks don't generally feed strangers for nothing." She turned to look at him then, her face silvered by moonlight. "My husband would have done the same. Besides, I've got flour to spare and those boys needed feeding." "We'll be moving on once Thomas is stronger," Royce promised. "Heading to Silverton. My brother's there." Josie nodded, returning her gaze to the stars. "Daniel will be back from his hunting trip tomorrow. He's 12 now, thinks he's a man grown." The pride in her voice was unmistakable. "He'll be glad for the company of other boys." They sat in companionable silence until Royce's exhaustion overtook him, and he retreated to the bedroll Josie had provided near the hearth. Morning brought sunshine streaming through the cabin windows and the smell of baking bread. Thomas's fever had broken overnight, and though weak, he was alert and smiling at Josie as she showed him how to knead dough with his small hands. "Look, Pa," he called when he spotted Royce. "I'm making bread." The simple joy in his son's voice after weeks of despair brought a lump to Royce's throat. "That's fine work, Thomas." Josie glanced up, flour dusting her cheeks and forehead. The morning light caught in her hair, revealing strands of gold among the brown. "He's a natural," she said with a smile. "Samuel's collecting eggs. Hope that's all right." "More than all right," Royce assured her. "Thank you for all of this." She waved away his thanks, turning back to the bread. "Thought you might help mend my chicken coop today in exchange for room and board until your boy's stronger." It was a kindness disguised as a business arrangement, preserving his pride while ensuring the boys would eat. Royce recognized it for what it was and nodded gratefully. The next several days fell into a rhythm. Royce worked from dawn to dusk, repairing the chicken coop, reinforcing the barn, and splitting enough firewood to last through winter. Samuel helped with the chickens and learned to milk Josie's cow, while Thomas, still regaining his strength, helped with simpler tasks like shelling peas and kneading bread. Daniel Sullivan returned from his hunting trip with 2 rabbits and wide-eyed excitement at finding visitors. He was tall for 12, with his mother's honey-brown hair and a smattering of freckles across his nose. After initial shyness, he took Samuel under his wing, showing him how to set traps and recognize animal tracks. "Your boy's good with mine," Josie remarked one evening as they watched the children playing a game of checkers by lamplight. "He's had to grow up fast," Royce replied, the regret evident in his voice. "Both of them have." Josie's hand briefly touched his arm the first time she'd initiated contact. "Children are resilient, Royce. They bounce back when given half a chance." The simple touch sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the evening heat. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with gentleness. "When do you plan to leave for Silverton?" she asked, withdrawing her hand. The question caught him off guard. Thomas was stronger now, and they'd been imposing on Josie's hospitality for nearly 2 weeks. The right thing would be to move on. "Soon," he answered, though the word tasted like ash. "Though I'd like to finish that irrigation channel first if you'll allow it." Josie's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, no rush." The next morning, Royce was digging the irrigation channel when Daniel came running from the woods, fear etched on his young face. "Mr. Miller, come quick, riders coming." Royce dropped his shovel, heart racing as he followed Daniel back to the cabin. Josie stood on the porch, rifle in hand, with the 3 boys behind her. In the distance, a cloud of dust marked approaching horsemen. "Get inside," Royce ordered, taking the rifle from Josie. "Could be those same raiders." "This is my home," she responded firmly, not budging. "And that's the Carson brothers. They've had their eye on my land since John died." Sure enough, 3 riders approached, slowing their horses as they neared the cabin. The lead man, broad-shouldered with a thick beard, surveyed the property before his gaze settled on Royce. "Well, well." Josie finally found herself a man, he drawled, a smirk playing at his lips. "Or hired help. State your business, Carson," Josie called, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her stance. "Same as always, Mrs. Sullivan," he replied, dismounting with casual confidence. "My offer to buy you out still stands. Land's too much for a woman and a boy to handle." "And same as always, my answer is no," she retorted. "This land is Sullivan land." Carson's expression hardened as he noticed the improvements Royce had made. "Seems you've been busy. Sheriff might be interested to know you've got a man living here unwed." Royce stepped forward, keeping the rifle visible but not raised. "The boys and I are passing through, lost our place to raiders east of here." "Raiders, huh?" Carson exchanged glances with his brothers. "Funny how many raiders been around lately, almost like someone's clearing land for cattle interests." The implication was clear, and Royce's grip tightened on the rifle. "You know something about that?" Carson smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Just making conversation." "But a widow woman alone." He shrugged, looking pointedly at Josie. "Accidents happen. Get off my property," Josie commanded, her voice like steel, "and don't come back." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats before Carson spat on the ground. "Think about my offer, Josie. Won't be on the table forever." With that, he and his brothers mounted up and rode away. Once they were out of sight, Josie's composure cracked. She sat heavily on the porch steps, hands trembling slightly. "How long has this been going on?" Royce asked, setting the rifle aside. "Since about 6 months after John died," she answered. "They want the water rights. My land controls access to the best part of the creek." Royce sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort without presuming. "Those men who burned me out, they mentioned new cattle interests moving in." Josie's eyes met his, understanding dawning. Carson works for the Blackwell Cattle Company. They've been buying up homesteads all over the territory. Or burning them out when folks won't sell, Royce added grimly. They sat in silence, contemplating the implications. Finally, Josie spoke. I can't leave this place, Royce. John and I built it from nothing. His grave is on that hill. She gestured toward a rise behind the barn. And Daniel, this is the only home he's ever known. Royce nodded, understanding completely. We'll be moving on to Silverton soon, he said, though the words felt wrong somehow. You'll be alone again. Josie looked at him then, really looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Do you want to go to Silverton, Royce? The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Did he want to leave? The answer surprised him with its clarity. No, he admitted quietly. I don't. That evening, after the children were asleep, Royce and Josie sat by the fire, a new awareness between them. I should tell you about Elizabeth, Royce said suddenly. My wife. Josie nodded, her hands busy with mending. I'd like to hear about her. So Royce spoke of Elizabeth, her laugh that could light up a room, her determination to make their rough homestead a home, her gentle way with the boys. He spoke of her illness, how it had taken her swiftly despite his desperate prayers, and how he'd been trying to hold things together since. When he finished, Josie set aside her mending and told him about John, a kind man, steady and true, who'd taught Daniel to fish and built this cabin with his own hands. How the Comanche raid had left her a widow with an 8-year-old son and a homestead to run alone. We've both loved and lost, she concluded softly. It marks you, doesn't it? It does, Royce agreed. Makes you afraid to risk your heart again. Josie's eyes met his across the dim room. Is that what this is, a risk? The question hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Royce found himself moving to sit beside her, close enough to catch the scent of lavender in her hair. I think it might be, he admitted. If you're willing. Instead of answering with words, Josie reached for his hand, her work-roughened fingers intertwining with his. It was a simple gesture, but it conveyed everything: understanding, comfort, possibility. The next morning, Royce woke with new resolve. After breakfast, he asked Josie if they could speak privately. Carson and his brothers will be back, he said without preamble once they were alone on the porch. And next time they might not just talk. Josie nodded, her expression grim. I know, but I won't be driven from my land. I'm not suggesting you should be, Royce clarified, but you need help defending it, real help. And you're offering, her tone was cautious, measuring. I am, he confirmed. The boys and I, we've got nowhere else that matters. If you'll have us, we'd like to stay. Josie's eyes widened slightly. As what exactly? Royce took a deep breath. As family, Josie, in time perhaps as more than that. A small smile played at her lips. That's quite an offer, Mr. Miller. It's the only one I have, he replied honestly. I can't replace John and you can't replace Elizabeth, but maybe we can build something new, together. Josie was quiet for so long that Royce feared he'd overstepped. Then she spoke, her voice soft but sure. The boys need a mother, and Daniel needs a father. And you? Royce asked, his heart pounding. What do you need? Her eyes met his, direct and honest. Someone to share the burden, someone to trust. She paused, then added more softly, someone to love in time. Royce reached for her hand, emboldened. I can be that if you'll let me. Their conversation was interrupted by excited shouts from the barn, where the boys were showing Samuel how to groom the horse. The sight of all 4 boys together, already functioning as brothers, cemented Royce's conviction. We should talk to the children, Josie suggested. See how they feel about this arrangement. To their relief, the children embraced the idea with enthusiasm. Daniel, especially, seemed pleased at the prospect of having brothers and a father figure. Thomas, still the youngest at 4, simply asked if this meant they would have bread every day now. Yes, Josie laughed, ruffling his hair. Plenty of bread. That night, after the children were asleep, Royce and Josie sat on the porch steps, shoulders touching as they gazed at the stars. The air between them had shifted, filled with possibility rather than grief. Carson will still come, Josie said after a while. Having you here won't stop him. No, Royce agreed. but it gives us a fighting chance, and I was thinking we should talk to other homesteaders. If Blackwell is behind the raids, we're stronger together than alone." Josie nodded slowly. "The Harrises to the south and the Winstons to the east. They've both mentioned similar threats." She turned to look at him. "You're talking about organizing resistance." "I'm talking about protecting our homes," he corrected gently. "Our future." The word "our" hung between them, full of promise. Josie's hand found his in the darkness, and when she spoke, her voice was steady with certainty. "Our future," she repeated. "I like the sound of that." The weeks that followed were filled with hard work and careful planning. Royce rode to neighboring homesteads, confirming his suspicions that Blackwell's men were systematically intimidating or driving out small farmers to consolidate land for cattle interests. Many families had already fled, but others remained, determined to hold onto their land. Together, they organized a rotating watch system. When Carson and his brothers returned with a larger group of men, they found not just Royce waiting, but half a dozen neighboring farmers, all armed and resolute. "This ain't over," Carson had snarled before retreating. "Blackwell won't stand for this." "Let him come himself, then," Royce had replied calmly. "We'll be waiting." As summer faded into autumn, life at the Sullivan homestead, now the Sullivan-Miller homestead, settled into a new rhythm. Royce and Josie worked side by side from dawn until dusk, their partnership growing stronger with each passing day. The boys thrived under their shared care, the haunted look gradually fading from Samuel and Thomas's eyes as regular meals and security worked their healing magic. One crisp October evening, as they harvested the last of the season's vegetables, Royce found himself watching Josie as she worked. The setting sun caught in her hair, and the simple joy on her face as she laughed at something Daniel said made his heart swell with an emotion he'd thought lost to him forever. Later, as they sat by the fire shelling beans, their fingers occasionally brushing, Royce gathered his courage. "Josie," he began, his voice low so as not to wake the sleeping children. "I've been thinking about our arrangement." Her hands stilled. "Oh, it's working well," he hastened to add. "Better than I could have hoped, but," she prompted when he hesitated. Royce set aside the beans and took her hands in his. "But I find myself wanting more than an arrangement. I want to court you properly, to build a life together not just out of necessity but because—" He paused, the words catching in his throat. "Because I'm falling in love with you, Josie Sullivan." In the firelight, he saw her eyes glisten with unshed tears. "Royce Miller," she whispered, "are you asking to court a widow with a 12-year-old son?" "I am," he confirmed, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "If she'll have me." Josie's smile was radiant. "She will." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise of things to come rather than a passionate declaration, yet it held within it all the hope and healing that had grown between them over the past months. Word came in November that Elias Blackwell himself would be arriving to deal with the troublemakers who had organized against his interests. Rather than cowering, the homesteaders saw an opportunity. They contacted the territorial marshal, providing evidence of Blackwell's tactics collected over months. When Blackwell arrived with Carson and a dozen hired guns, he found not only the united homesteaders but also Marshal Jenkins and 3 deputies waiting. The evidence against him was damning written threats, testimonies from burned-out farmers, and even a confession from one of Carson's own men who'd turned state's evidence. "This isn't the end," Blackwell had snarled as the marshal led him away in handcuffs. "I have friends in high places." "Maybe so," Royce had replied, "but we have something stronger: community." With Blackwell facing charges and Carson's brothers fleeing the territory, a tentative peace settled over the land. The homesteaders continued their alliance, helping one another through the winter with shared resources and labor. On Christmas Eve, with a dusting of snow covering the ground outside and the children asleep after an evening of stories and simple gifts, Royce knelt before Josie by the hearth. "I know it's soon," he said, holding out his late wife's silver locket, But I believe Elizabeth would want you to have this, and I believe John would approve of what I'm about to ask." Tears filled Josie's eyes as she recognized the significance of the gesture. "Royce." "Josephine Sullivan," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "will you marry me? Will you join our families in truth as well as deed?" Her yes was barely audible, but the kiss that followed spoke volumes. When they finally parted, both breathless and smiling, Josie rested her forehead against his. "From hunger to happiness," she whispered. "Who would have thought a bit of flour and kindness could lead to this?" Royce drew her close, marveling at how completely his life had transformed in the span of a few months. "God provides," he murmured, echoing his own words to his sons that desperate night beneath the stars. "Sometimes in ways we never expected." They were married on New Year's Day, 1883, in the small church in town, surrounded by their children and the neighbors who had become extended family. The boys stood proudly as witnesses, Daniel as tall as Royce's shoulder now, Samuel solemn in his new shirt, and Thomas beaming as he carried the rings. Spring brought new beginnings. The Sullivan Miller farm thrived under their combined efforts. The alliance of homesteaders formalized into a cooperative that gave them bargaining power with markets in larger towns. And Josie's announcement that a baby would join their family by autumn was met with whoops of joy from all four boys. On warm evenings, Royce would often find Josie on the porch steps, just as he had that first night. He would sit beside her, their shoulders touching, hands intertwined, watching the stars emerge as their children played in the yard. "You ever think about how close we came to missing this?" she asked one such evening, her head resting on his shoulder. "If raiders hadn't burned you out? If you hadn't taken in 3 starving strangers," he added, pressing a kiss to her temple. "If the boys hadn't slept hungry for those weeks." Royce tightened his arm around her. "I used to question why God would allow such suffering. Now I wonder if sometimes the hardest paths lead us exactly where we need to be." Josie's hand rested on her growing belly, a smile playing at her lips. "To exactly who we need to be with." The laughter of their sons, for they were all their sons now, in heart if not all in blood, floated across the twilight air. Samuel was teaching Daniel a song he remembered from his mother, while Thomas chased fireflies with the enthusiasm only a 5-year-old could muster. "I love you, Josie Miller," Royce whispered, still marveling at how right her new name sounded. "And I love you," she replied, turning her face up to his for a kiss that tasted of promise fulfilled and hopes renewed. Flower, heart, and all. As darkness settled over their home, Royce Miller counted his blessings: a loving wife, healthy sons, land that provided, and a community that stood together. From the ashes of despair had risen something beautiful and enduring. The hunger was long past, but the heart that had been shared with him that desperate day remained his greatest treasure.